Great. Hi, everyone. My name is KJ Schmidt. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a white woman with brownish blonde, medium length hair. And in my headshot picture on slide, I'm joined by my lovely dog, Reed, who is a very happy yellow lab Australian Shepherd mix. So as Tilly said, I'm the lead accessibility designer at ADP. And today we're going to talk a little bit about monsters and HTML in the session titled ARIA Afraid of the Dark, Unmasking HTML Monsters for Better User Experiences. So here's the big question. Why should UXers get familiar with the basic HTML and ARIA monsters? Simply put, we're responsible for designing the user experience. Some of that experience comes from visual designs, content, interactions, and the flows we create. But for assistive technologies, there are some additional important experiences that are coming from the HTML and ARIA techniques. For instance, here I have a picture of a button. It's a blue circle, and it has a white downward pointing chevron icon inside of it. How does a blind or low vision screen reader user know what this element is and what it will do? When coded correctly, a screen reader might announce details, collapsed, button, when the button is focused. But why? How did it know to say those things? We'll need to learn a little bit about the role that HTML and ARIA play in creating user experiences to find our answer. So today, we'll get started with defeating, or befriending if you prefer, some of these HTML and ARIA monsters, including HTML elements, attributes, ARIA, roles, and accessible names. And then I'll walk through a few examples of how you can put this knowledge to use as a UXer. And a quick note before we get started, code can be complicated and overwhelming, so breathe. Remember, you don't need to become an expert in any of these topics unless you're a developer listening in today. Your developers are your friends, I hope, and so they can help you too. And if you don't have the privilege of having a direct relationship with your developer, maybe find developers in the accessibility communities online or others in your organization that you can become friends with. And finally, it's a big topic, so take in what you can today and revisit over time to keep building your knowledge. Okay, so let's see what we can take in today. So let's start with our first monster, the HTML elements. So slowly we approach this monster and we find that it's not actually a scary monster. It's just a sandwich. And for anyone who could not see it, on screen I had an illustration of a ghost that just turned into a sandwich. And your imagination of what that looked like is probably much cooler than my illustrations were. All right, so what are HTML elements? HTML elements are a foundation of what our designs are coded with. Buttons are HTML elements, tables are made of HTML elements, paragraphs, lists, links, and more are made of HTML elements. So let's look at a very simple button. On screen, I have a blue rectangular button with the text inside that says, I am a button. And below is a simple version of the HTML code we could use to create a button. We're going to break this code down in the next few slides, so I'm not going to describe it in depth here, but just to describe that code for anyone who can't see it, we have the word button inside of some brackets, followed by the text, I am a button, and then a backslash and the word button inside of another set of angular brackets at the end. Okay, so let's see how this piece of code is actually just a sandwich. I took our same code and formatted it now into a sandwich. Our sandwich has a piece of bread on the top, a piece of cheese in the middle, and another piece of bread on the bottom. And similarly, an HTML element has a start tag at the start, some content in the middle, and an end tag at the end. Our start and end tags are the bread of our HTML sandwich. If we code a page with a bunch of different elements, the start and end tags help us organize things by telling us where one element begins and ends, and keeping all of the code for each element contained between its start and end tags. The start tag is written like this. We have an opening angular bracket, the element type, which in this case is button, and then a closing angular bracket. And then our end tag is almost the same, except it has a backslash after the first angular bracket. So it reads as opening angular bracket, backslash, the word button, and then closing angular bracket. In between the pieces of bread, we have the sandwich contents. And so just like this sandwich has some cheese between the pieces of bread, HTML elements contain contents between their start and end tags. In this example, the button text, "I am a button," is the cheese or the contents inside of this element sandwich. And just as sandwiches come in different types, HTML elements also come in different types. They generally follow the same sandwiched pattern: start tag, contents, and then an end tag. And by changing the types of start and end tags, we can create different elements. For instance, if we place the text, "I love HTML," between a set of paragraph start and end tags, which we can create by putting the letter P inside of the angular brackets, we can create some paragraph text that says, "I love HTML." Or if we place that same text between a set of heading level 3 tags instead, which we can create by putting the letter H and the number 3 inside of the angular brackets, we can make a level 3 heading that says, "I love HTML." There are a lot of different HTML element types, and you don't need to know them all, but here are just some more examples. We can have the different heading levels from heading level 1 to heading level 6, inputs and labels, so like checkboxes, radio buttons, and text fields, links and buttons, numbered lists and bulleted lists, and tables. And now some elements are small sandwiches, like our button was, but some elements are bigger and made by nesting other smaller elements inside of them. So you can think of this like making a big sandwich that has multiple smaller sandwiches inside of it. And bulleted lists are a good example of a big sandwich. Our example design here includes a bulleted list with 2 items in it, option A and option B. And on the right, I'm representing this list as a big sandwich made with 6 pieces of bread and 2 pieces of cheese. So let's break this sandwich down. Our outside sandwich has 2 pieces of bread, one at the very top and one at the very bottom. They represent the start and end tag for our unordered list element, written as the letters UL inside of the angular brackets for the start and end tags. An unordered list is just what we call bulleted lists in the HTML world. All of the bulleted list items will then be nested inside of the unordered list start and end tags. Inside our unordered list sandwich, instead of a piece of cheese, we have 2 sandwiches stacked right on top of each other. And each sandwich is a list item element. We can make a list item by putting the letters LI inside of the start and end tags. And each list item has a start tag, some contents, and an end tag. And the contents of each of these list item elements is the text found in each bulleted item. So option A is the first list item, and option B is the second list item. And before we get overwhelmed, I'm not saying we all need to learn how to code complex sandwiches and elements. However, recognizing that these nested structures exist is important for accessibility. You may have heard the term programmatically associated before, as in, these things need to be programmatically associated for accessibility. And structures like this nested sandwich are one way that we can create a programmatic, or really just means coded, association. It's by grouping and nesting things together in a way that's creating a coded relationship between the items. And sometimes these relationships communicate important things to screen readers. For instance, when VoiceOver, which is a type of screen reader, encounters this list, because the items are coded together properly and using the proper HTML elements, we might hear something like list, 2 items, option A, 1 of 2, option B, 2 of 2. And that's an experience created by the code. not created by our design or any extra content that we provided. So, phew, we have defeated or befriended monster number 1. HTML elements are not actually monsters, they're just sandwiches. And one quick note before we continue with more examples, not all screen readers announce things exactly the same way. The examples of screen reader announcements that I have in this presentation are based on the screen reader called VoiceOver, being run in the browser Safari, with the specific user settings that I have set up on my testing device. But different settings or different screen readers or even different versions may announce things differently. So it's just good to keep in mind. Okay, time for monster number 2, attributes. These are also sometimes called properties. They both mean the same thing. And folks, this is probably going to be the scariest section of them all, so hang in there, we will get through it together. So slowly we approach monster number 2 and we find it's not a scary monster. Attributes are just fancy bread. HTML attributes add additional information about the element. They go inside of the start tag, aka the bread. So you can think of this like adding seeds, wild rice, grains, chocolate, whatever you want to your bread to make it just a little bit fancier than some plain white bread. They're typically written with the following format. We have an attribute name, the equal sign, and then some value, which will be inside of quotation marks. For instance, in my example here, I have a button element, and inside of that start tag, after the word button, I have 2 different attributes. The name of the first attribute is class, and it's written as class equals my-button, and that's my value that's inside of quotation marks. And then right after that attribute, I have a second attribute. And the second attribute is called ARIA pressed, and it has a value of true. So it's written as ARIA-pressed equals the word true wrapped in quotation marks. And in the corner of the slide, I have a picture of a piece of white bread looking up at that fancy bread code saying, wow, that bread is fancy. So what can attributes do? We can use attributes to customize things like the appearance and behavior of the elements. We can use them to add names, text alternatives, and information about the element. We can use them to establish coded relationships between elements, and more. They're really powerful parts of the HTML element. And we're not going to get into all the complexities and possibilities of attributes today, but let's just talk about some of the attributes that are important for accessibility. The first attribute we'll talk about is the alt attribute. The alt attribute provides important accessibility information. Whenever we have a static image that communicates information, that image needs a text alternative, or alt text. This ensures assistive technologies can describe the image to anyone who cannot see it. One way we can do this is by using the alt attribute. To add a text alternative to an image element, we can add our text description as the value for the alt attribute. For instance, I have an image of the ADP logo here, and inside of the image HTML element, I provided a value for its alt attribute of ADP logo. So it reads as alt equals ADP logo in quotation marks. Now, when a screen reader, such as VoiceOver, encounters that image, they'll hear something like ADP logo, graphic, or ADP logo, image. And surprise, a new monster has appeared out of nowhere called ARIA. Okay, what is ARIA? ARIA stands for Accessible, Rich, Internet Applications. And you never have to remember that. I even had to Google it for this presentation. So just remember ARIA. ARIA is a category of attributes and roles, so AKA fancy bread, that we can use to make elements more accessible, especially for screen reader users. And anyone writing HTML can use them. You don't need to download or buy anything. you can just use them like you can use HTML. They follow the same pattern as the attributes I showed before. We have attribute name equals some value. And you can recognize the ARIA attributes by finding attribute names that begin with the word ARIA, such as ARIA pressed, ARIA label, ARIA expanded, and ARIA hidden. There's a predefined list of ARIA attributes that you can use, so you can't create custom ARIA attributes. And at the end of this presentation, there's a link with some different resources if you're interested in exploring those different ARIA attributes. So ARIA is a pretty big topic. Different ARIA attributes are used for different purposes, but for today, we're going to focus specifically on ARIA attributes that are used to provide more information about an element. So some ARIA attributes can provide information about an element by describing the behaviors and states of that element, like ARIA expanded, ARIA selected, and more. And others can be used to provide more information, like a name or a description of the element, like ARIA label, ARIA labeled by, and ARIA described by. We'll talk about names a little later today, so we'll focus first just on behaviors and states. So what do I mean when I say ARIA attributes provide information about behaviors and states? We learned before that screen readers can announce and use information provided by the HTML element type, like when the list announced information about it being a list, how many items it had, etc. ARIA attributes can provide even more information that screen readers announce with details about how an element will behave. So let's look at some examples of these attributes and see how they impact the user experience. So first, let's look at the ARIA pressed attribute. This attribute will tell us if a button is pressed or not. On the screen, we have a toggleable button that we can press to pause a video. Visually, when I press this button, I can see that the button changes. It goes from a blue button with white text to a white button with a blue border and blue text. Screen readers don't announce that visual change. So how can a screen reader communicate the difference in these states? We can use the ARIA pressed attribute on our pause button. By adding the ARIA pressed attribute to our start tag, screen readers will announce whether this button is pressed or not, depending on whether the attribute value is true or false. So when ARIA pressed is false, VoiceOver will announce something like pause, toggle button. And that lets me know that this button can be toggled, but it's not currently selected. After I select the button, the ARIA pressed attribute is updated to true. When ARIA pressed equals true, VoiceOver will announce something like pause, selected, toggle button. Now I know that this button is selected. The words toggle button and selected are added to the experience for free by using the ARIA pressed attribute. As a designer or writer, I didn't add any content or change the button label to make this happen. We just took advantage of the experience that our developers can create by using this ARIA attribute. And this button's a really good example to highlight how different screen readers may announce things a little bit differently. Some attributes result in similar spoken announcements between devices, but ARIA pressed gets announced a little differently depending on the software. With VoiceOver, we hear pause toggle button and pause selected toggle button. But with NVDA, which is another type of screen reader, we might hear button, pause, not pressed, and button, pause, pressed. In this example, both of these are fine. The differences are okay because they're still communicating all the information we need. But it's a good example of why developers and testers should be testing with multiple softwares. The devices don't always behave the same or even support all of the same attributes. One screen reader might announce an attribute that another screen reader ignores entirely. All right, so let's look at a second example with a different attribute, ARIA expanded. This attribute will tell us whether something is expanded or collapsed. In my example, I have an accordion section that is currently closed. The accordion header has a big button that contains a downward pointing arrow and text that says, "Things that my dog likes." I can select that entire big button to open and close the content. Visually, I can easily see whether the content is shown or hidden and recognize which control I should use to toggle it. So how can we provide that same information to a screen reader? By adding the ARIA expanded attribute to our button, screen readers will announce whether the content controlled by this button is expanded or collapsed, depending on whether the attribute value is true or false. When ARIA expanded is false, a screen reader will announce something like, "Things that my dog likes, collapsed, button." This lets me know that I can use the button to expand or collapse content and that the content is currently collapsed. Now, if I select the button, the ARIA expanded attribute should be updated to true. And when ARIA expanded equals true, a screen reader will announce something like, "Things that my dog likes, expanded, button." Now I know that the content is expanded, and I can access the content inside of the accordion, which in this case lists off treats, belly rubs, and sleeping on 3/4 of my bed. The words expanded and collapsed are added to the experience for free by using the ARIA expanded attribute. Again, as a designer or a writer, I didn't add any content or change the button label to make this happen. We just took advantage of that experience that our developers can create with that ARIA attribute. So when should I use ARIA? You don't always need to use ARIA attributes. It's easy to get excited when we learn about all of the free stuff we can get, but we want to be sure to only use it when it really provides value. If the HTML element provides sufficient information and context without adding ARIA, then we don't need it. So let's go back to our example of our bid sandwich, or the unordered list. Without any added ARIA attributes, screen readers announce something like list, 2 items, option A, 1 of 2, option B, 2 of 2. And that's great. We don't need any additional context to understand these list items. The built-in context is sufficient, and we don't need any ARIA attributes. This is something that we can collaborate with our developers and testers to find out. So, phew, we have defeated 2 more monsters. Attributes and ARIA aren't actually monsters. They're just fancy bread. Okay, monster number 4, roles. So slowly we approach this monster and we find it's not a scary monster. Roles are just different kinds of sandwiches. So like we can have different types of sandwiches, we can also have different kinds of elements. The role defines what the element is, and they again come from a predefined set of role options. For example, a button should have a role of button. A link should have a role of link. The roles describe what the element or group of elements is. And for many elements, that role is also announced by screen readers for free. We don't need to add any fancy content to make a screen reader tell users what the element is. They will announce it automatically if the role is present for many different types of elements. So for screen reader users, knowing the role provides necessary information to predict what an element is and how to interact with it. For instance, if we learn that an element is a button, we expect that we can use the spacebar or the enter key to activate it, and that activating it will do something within our current page, because that's what buttons do. And if we learn that the element is a link, we expect that we can activate it with the enter key, and that activating it is going to take us to a new page, because that's what links do. Screen readers can also use certain roles to help categorize content and provide more efficient navigation. For instance, most screen readers allow users to pull up quick lists of items that they can navigate to directly, such as a list of all of the page's headings, or buttons, or links, or form controls. So I have an example of a screen reader menu for a fake web page that's listing all of the items with heading roles, such as heading level 1, my dog Reed, level 2, facts about Reed, level 3, early life, level 3, breed, level 3, current living situation. Level 2, things Reed likes. And final level 2, is he a good boy? So we could navigate this list and jump directly to any of these headings because they were coded with heading roles. Or users can also use some keyboard shortcuts when they're using screen readers to cycle directly between things that have different roles. For instance, using some sort of modifier key plus the letter H to cycle focus between the headings on the page. So all this to say, using roles properly can provide a ton of value. Okay, great. Roles are useful. So how does an element get its role? With most HTML elements, the role is baked in by default, so we get it for free. An element using the HTML button tags has a role of button. Elements using the HTML heading tags have a role of heading. But you can also override the baked-in role by adding the role attribute in the start tag, so just like making fancy bread. Adding a role to an HTML element is like putting on a costume. Just like my sandwich illustration I have here, which is wearing one of those plastic disguise glasses with a fake nose and mustache, and it's saying, "I'm not a turkey club sandwich, I'm actually a grilled cheese." So let's look at an example of an element in a costume. In this example, I have a button start tag, but inside of the start tag, I added role equals tab. This element is no longer a button, it's a tab. And when screen readers encounter this element, they'll announce it as a tab rather than as a button. And knowing that it's a tab, we may have completely different expectation of this element than if we thought it was just a button. We expect tabs are part of a group of related tabs. The tabs control some content on the page, and some content is probably currently hidden behind the tabs that aren't selected. So if I navigate to those other related tabs, I can show different information. If it were just a button, we wouldn't necessarily expect all of this behavior in context. We learn all of that just by changing the role from button to tab. So why do we even have ARIA roles? Why wouldn't I just create a tab element using the word tab inside of the angular brackets like we did with button? And that is an excellent instinct. If we can use native HTML element without adding an ARIA role, we absolutely should. However, HTML does not have a native element for everything that would be useful for screen reader users to know. So ARIA can identify types of elements that don't have native HTML equivalents. For instance, HTML doesn't have a tab element, so we use the ARIA roles to create one, because we've decided that that does provide useful context that buttons alone don't. ARIA includes additional useful roles that can provide more detailed context about an element for screen reader users. We don't really need to understand why HTML does not have all of these elements. Just know that ARIA opens up even more options. These additional ARIA roles can help create more user-friendly experiences when used correctly. So some examples of these roles are tab, tab list, which is like a group of tabs, and tab panel, which is the place where your tab content goes. Toolbar, menu bar, menu, alert and status for dynamic messages, and honestly, a ton more. So again, just like the ARIA attributes we talked about before, there is a predefined list of these roles that we can use. We can't create custom ones. So I'll also add a link to those at the end of the presentation. So when do I need ARIA roles? As I mentioned before, sometimes when we learn about ARIA, we get super excited, rightfully, because it can do some cool stuff. But unfortunately, ARIA often gets used when it's not necessary, giving us overly dense bread that has more stuff in it than we really need. If we do too much, we can negatively impact the experience for folks or make things more complicated than they need to be. So let's only use ARIA when native HTML on its own cannot provide sufficient value for the user experience. So let's look at another example where ARIA isn't needed. I have a plain white bread button that says sign in at the end of a username and password form. When a screen reader encounters this button, it will say something like sign in button. And this white bread button is doing great. It doesn't need anything fancy. we can use a native HTML button element here without any ARIA roles. All right, we have defeated yet another monster. Roles aren't monsters, they're just different types of sandwiches, and sometimes they're sandwiches wearing costumes. All right, time to meet our fifth and final monster, the accessible name. So slowly we approach this monster and we find that it's not a scary monster. Accessible names are just what we call the thing. And I have an image of one of those red sticker name tags that says, "Hello, my name is KJ." So let's take a quick terminology pause here. You may have heard some of these different terms thrown around before, like accessible name, ARIA label, label or name, programmatic text, text alternative or alternative text or alt text. And unfortunately, it can get a little confusing because people use a lot of these terms informally or interchangeably to kind of mean the same thing sometimes. And there can be a lot of overlap even between their formal definitions too. For example, an accessible name can also be an ARIA label. An ARIA label is a type of programmatic text. Alt text is one way to provide a text alternative, but it's not the only way. So often folks will use any of these to generally refer to some text that a screen reader is going to announce as an alternative to some visual. So like someone might say, "I need alt text for this button," even though we don't use the alt attribute on buttons, or "What's the label for this icon?" without really specifying what kind of label they're talking about. And if you get the idea that, what they're talking about is they need some content, then you're good to go. You can create some content. But if you aren't sure, or it's important that you're aligned on the correct term or method when it really does matter, you can always ask for clarification to make sure you're on the same page. So with that said, we're going to start with talking about accessible name. What is the accessible name? The accessible name is a piece of information that assistive technologies, such as screen readers, can use to identify the element. It's attached to the element in the code. Screen readers will announce the name when focus moves to that element. And users of voice recognition software, which we haven't talked about yet, but they can speak the name of that element to target and activate different controls. So for example, our menu button here has a name of menu, and our home link has a name of home. So how does something get its accessible name? Where does it come from? There are multiple ways to provide an accessible name, and as a UXer, you don't need to be an expert on when to use which method. You can leave that up to your developers. The name either comes from the bread by adding ARIA label or ARIA labeled by attributes to make it into some fancy bread, or the name can come from the sandwich contents using whatever built-in HTML text is in that element. One thing to note is that you cannot create a compound name that combines multiple methods. So you can't create a name that takes a little bit from the bread and a little bit from the cheese. There is a hierarchy if you have names provided with multiple methods, so that only one of them becomes the accessible name. So let's look at a few examples. For our first example, I have a picture of a button with the word menu on it. This example shows the accessible name coming from the contents inside of the element. Our element sandwich is using the button element in the start tag, and inside of the sandwich is the word menu. This is the name of our button. The same piece of code that tells the button which text to display is providing the name in this case. So when a screen reader encounters this button, it will announce the name and the role. So menu button. And using the inner HTML element text is the preferred method anytime the visible text on the element provides a sufficient name. But sometimes our elements don't have sufficient text or don't have any text at all. When the text inside the element isn't available or specific enough, we can add a name to the bread using the ARIA label attribute. Whatever value we put in the ARIA label attribute is going to be the accessible name of the element. For instance, in this example, I have a blue button with a hamburger menu icon and no text. Inside of my button sandwich, I have an icon, but I don't have any text. In the button start tag, I added the ARIA label equals menu. So for this element, the accessible name is menu. When a screen reader encounters this button, it will announce the name and role. So menu button. And here's one more example, but this time our element has both inner text and an ARIA label. I have an example of a link that says learn more. Inside of the code sandwich is the text learn more. In the link start tag, I have an ARIA label with a value learn more about sandwiches. ARIA labels take priority over the inner text, so the name for this element is learn more about sandwiches rather than just learn more. So when a screen reader encounters this link, it will announce the name and the role. So learn more about sandwiches, link. All right, phew, we have defeated that final monster. Accessible names aren't actually monsters. They're just what we call the thing. Uh-oh, watch out, our monster has just appeared again, and to defeat it, we need to use everything we learned to figure out as much as we can about this element. So in the start tag, we have a button element with a role of tab and an attribute of ARIA selected equals true. In the contents, we have the text dogs, and then we have the end button tag. Okay, let's start with the start tag. First, I notice that it uses a button element. So this element might be a button, but I also see that the start tag has a role of tab. I remember that roles override the HTML native elements. It's like a button wearing a costume. So actually, this element is a tab, not a button. Also in the start tag, I notice the ARIA selected attribute, which is set to true. This means that the tab is selected. Finally, inside the sandwich, I notice the text dogs. I don't notice an ARIA label or ARIA labeled by attribute in the start tag, so I know that this text must be the name. The tab is named dogs. So what we have is a tab element named dogs, and it's selected. When a screen reader focuses this tab, it will announce something like dogs, selected tab. And just for fun, if we build this into a giant sandwich, we can get even more free stuff. So let's wrap this entire group of tabs in an element that has a role of tab list, just like we did with the bulleted list before. Now, when that tab is focused, we'll hear dogs, selected tab, 3 of 4. Again, so much free stuff that we got without adding or writing any extra content. Okay, we've defeated a bunch of monsters, but what do I do with this information? You don't need to be coding your designs or, bossing your developers around, telling them which roles and attributes to use, especially if they do already know. But here are some ways that you can put this knowledge into action as a UXer. Let's say we have a switch control on our page to turn notifications on or off, and we want to make sure that we've provided any necessary content to make it accessible to screen readers. So let's start by listing what we know. We know what roles are. Screen readers will often announce them, and they give more context about what an element is and how it might work. We also know what accessible names are. They tell users what the name or purpose of this specific control is. And we know that every control, including this switch, needs one. Next, I know that screen readers may also announce some other content from some attributes. So before I write any extra content, I'm going to think about what am I going to get for free? And if I don't know what roles or attributes this element will use, I can collaborate with developers, and now I can ask better questions. So again, I don't have to be the expert on all of this stuff. By knowing which questions to ask, I can work together with my developer to figure it out. Or if I don't have easy access to work with my own developer, I can find developers in the accessibility communities online, in person, or use internet searches to help answer my questions. So let's say maybe my conversation with my developer sounds a little bit like this. I'll ask my developer, what type of element would you use to code this? Would you use any ARIA attributes? And they may respond, this will use the switch role and ARIA checked to say if it's turned on or off. And then I'll say, you're the best. And then she'll say, no, you are, and we'll go our separate ways, having had a productive conversation. Or maybe they'll say, I don't know. Oftentimes our developers are learning too, so now we can work together and look it up. Okay, now that I know what this element is, it's a switch, and I know the ARIA properties it'll use, ARIA checked, I can figure out what stuff is announced for free already. And again, if I don't know the answer, I can collaborate with others to find out. Our conversation might go something like this. I ask my developer or tester, hey, what will screen readers announce for switches with ARIA checked? And she might respond, we'll hear the role, switch, and depending on the screen reader, something like on and off. And then I'll say, you're my hero. And they'll respond, I know. Or again, when I ask them, they might say, I don't know. And we can try to find or make an example to test together with a screen reader, because remember, oftentimes our developers are also still learning too, and we can learn together. And now, equipped with information, I can decide what additional content to provide, if any, to make sure screen reader users have enough information without getting redundant or confusing information about the switch control. I might originally have been tempted to add an ARIA label name to the switch that says toggle switch to turn on notifications. But since I'll get information announced for free from the role and attributes, I now know that that's too much. With that content, a screen reader might announce something like toggle switch to turn on notifications, switch off, which is kind of confusing and just more content than we need. So because we know what we get for free, a better option for this switch is just to leave the visible text, notifications, as the accessible name and not add anything else. A screen reader will now announce something like notifications, switch off, or notifications, switch on, which is much cleaner to listen to and it's easier to code. Okay, one last example here. This time I'm going to use what I know to decide which control to use in my design. This scenario is going to be more common if you're working with a design system or pre-made components that have their roles or a lot of their code already baked into them. So let's say I have a set of tabs on my page and I need to pick which design to use. I have two options that might work. One of them shows 3 interactive elements in a horizontal layout, and whichever one I select gets highlighted with a little blue underline. My other option looks like 3 regular buttons in a horizontal layout, and whichever one I select gets a darker fill. So what can I think about to help make this decision? Again, let's list what we know. First, I know that different elements have different roles. And we also know that roles get announced to screen readers, and different roles create different interaction and context expectations. So now, I'm going to be mindful to use the right component, not just based on its appearance, but also based on which role is most appropriate for this context. So maybe I know the roles of these components, but if I don't, I can once again ask a developer for help. I might ask, which component should I use for my page tabs? And she might respond by telling me about the roles for each element. For the first option, she says, these are coded with role of tab in a tab group. And for the second option, she says, these are coded as individual buttons. And so then I say, great, I'll use the ones that have the tab role for my page tabs. And so in that way, I used information about the code to help make a design decision. All right, folks, we did it. We learned about a bunch of different powerful HTML and ARIA tools, how they impact user experiences, and how we can put some of that information into practice so that we can collaborate with our developers, ask better questions, and design better experiences. And for any of those who are weird like me and you want to know more code, there will be some resources at the end of these slides, but also if you just do an online search for ARIA attributes, ARIA roles, and HTML elements, you're going to find a ton of great resources really quickly. So that said, I'm all done. I'll hand it back to you, Tilly, for any questions.
AJ, you're amazing, awesome. People would like a sandwich t-shirt. They would like a book. They were helping each other in chat with questions. There were lots of questions. We were anticipating this. Let's see if we can take a couple of them here, and thank you in advance for offering to answer them after the fact so that we don't have to feel rushed. The first one is, what do you feel are the best publicly available resources for learning and mastering ARIA? You already shared some of them. How can I become an expert on my own?
Yeah, so I think looking up some of those resources, ARIA has a standard and a spec online. It is pretty dense, so it's not everyone's learning style, but if you really like documentation, they've got lots of great documentation that you can work your way through. Personally, for myself, the thing that I did, I was not paid to say this, but I went through a lot of the DQ University courses, which Tilly can correct me if I'm wrong, but when I signed up a few years ago, you could get access to some of those for free if you signed up and said that you had a disability and needed free access.
Yep,
so
correct.
Yeah, so potentially free resources, but otherwise they're not particularly expensive. But I worked through a lot of their different developers curriculum. And again, it's relatively dense, but it's really well written. And I found that to be a really great way to get familiar with the stuff. And I keep access to those so that I use them like an encyclopedia now. So even if I read through it all once and learned all of the stuff, I didn't memorize it all right away. But now it's great because I remember what kind of content's there. And maybe I'm designing something and I want to grab a quick example, or I want to remember what ARIA Expanded does. I can go pull up my DQ University encyclopedia and get all of that information. There's going to be other great places like there's a accessibility Slack channel out there that you do need to be invited to, but if you are not in there and you would like to be, feel free to find me on LinkedIn and I can figure out how to get you an invite there. But I've asked tons of questions there and had super knowledgeable developers and testers and users answer those questions. So they're really, depending on your learning style, like the sky's the limit on the types of ways that you can learn about ARIA.
That's awesome. Second question, our dev teams continue to make mistakes implementing ARIA. I keep hearing about ARIA-related accessibility defects. What can I do to help them?
Yeah, well, you can send them this talk, but I mean, you honestly can. But they, at least our developers, have a foundational knowledge about a lot of these coding things we talked about today. So they should hopefully be able to snap up the ARIA aspects from these and plug that into their existing models of how coding works, how attributes work. And be able to work with that much faster. So first of all, they should hopefully be able to pick it up pretty fast if we can get them that information. Sharing resources within your team or your organization is great. And finding ways to support any accessibility efforts that are going on at your company kind of larger will be really important. Any of those like scalable initiatives so that you're not taking it on yourself to educate your developer and be resented for doing your developer's job. It's really hard as one designer to try and change an entire organization. So I think try and work smarter, not harder, find ways that we can start supporting larger culture changes or larger things that will eventually put that responsibility on every person to be doing their education. Like maybe developers will have some sort of initiative that they all need to do a certain type of education program and things. So sharing resources when you can, but really finding ways to support larger scalable efforts to make a culture change within your organization is going to be the best bang for your buck.
I'm going to borrow a page from your presentation, also make it approachable, light, easy to understand. You made this so easy to follow, and it was clear how it was resonating with everyone that was participating here.
Okay.
KJ, thank you so much for an awesome session. Everyone here participating, thank you for coming. Make sure you keep the conversation going.